America's biggest garlic producer has fallen. Bankrupt. Gone. Not because of drought, not because of pests, but because Africa just flipped the table in global trade. Some in Washington call this unfair. Others say it's justice. For decades, the U.S. flooded the world with cheap garlic, crushing small farmers everywhere. Now the continent they once ignored is sending shockwaves back across the Atlantic. And here's the moment no one saw coming. From Burkina Faso to Ethiopia, African farmers are turning a simple bulb into a billion-dollar weapon of sovereignty, and the United States can't stop it. Before we go deeper, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Are you in America where empty shelves are sparking debates about trade? Or in Africa where garlic has become a symbol of pride? Or maybe in Europe where buyers are switching suppliers overnight? Drop a comment with your experience, your habits, or even your choices in the supermarket, because this story connects directly to your daily life. And hey, welcome to Africa Daily, Good News. This is where we break the headlines the West doesn't want you to hear, and where we bring you closer to Africa's rise with honesty, wit, and a little fire. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's step into the real story. Not just numbers, not just contracts, but how Africa's garlic boom rewrote the rules of global farming, and why Washington is scrambling to understand what just happened. Imagine walking into an American supermarket and finding the garlic shelf half empty, not because of a supply chain glitch or a strike, but because Africa quietly stole the market. That's the paradox shaking rural America right now. For decades, California's Central Valley symbolized abundance. Rows of garlic fields, endless trucks hauling harvests to ports, a sense of security that the world's spice rack could never shift. Yet today, the same valley is dotted with foreclosure signs, silent machinery, and farmers wondering how a crop once so stable could vanish beneath their feet. Across the ocean, from Burkina Faso to Ethiopia, a very different picture emerges. Shipments of fresh African garlic are leaving ports at record speed, feeding markets in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. According to trade reports, Africa's garlic exports surged by more than 500% last year, a number so staggering that even lobbyists in Washington admit it blindsided them. Here's the twist most Americans don't realize. This wasn't a freak event. It was the outcome of years of investment in irrigation, seed variety, and farmer cooperatives. While the U.S. industry grew complacent, Africa rewrote the playbook. Think about it. Most Americans assume grocery store garlic comes from California or maybe China. Few stop to ask why prices suddenly dipped or why imports shifted overnight. But human behavior tells us something simple. When a product is fresher, cheaper, and cleaner, consumers adapt instantly. Studies on consumer habits show that shoppers rarely stay loyal if a better option is right in front of them. And that's exactly how Africa undercut the U.S., by presenting a choice so obvious that buyers across continents didn't even hesitate. Consider the story of one California grower who had supplied supermarkets for 3 generations. Last year, he told a local paper that his contracts dried up in a matter of weeks once African garlic hit international shelves. His farm, once buzzing with seasonal workers, became eerily quiet. It's the kind of reversal that feels personal, not just economic. If a family business that survived droughts and recessions couldn't withstand African competition, what chance do smaller farms have? And doesn't that raise a bigger question? If Africa can do this with garlic, what happens when it scales the same strategy to wheat, corn, or soybeans? The mood in the Midwest is anxious, while the mood in Ouagadougou's markets is triumphant. Two sides of the same coin, linked by a global shift that caught Washington flat-footed. And as this contrast sharpens, it leads us directly into the next chapter, where the quiet revolution behind Africa's garlic boom reveals itself as part of something far larger than food. How does a continent once labeled the world's food aid recipient suddenly become the nightmare of America's farm economy? That contradiction is what global analysts are trying to unpack right now. For decades, Africa was painted as dependent, fragile, unable to compete in global agriculture. And yet, within a single decade, garlic turned from a symbol of import reliance into a 60 billion export powerhouse. Reports from trade organizations confirm that African garlic exports have surged at unprecedented rates, with contracts stretching years ahead. Buyers in Europe and Asia now bypass California altogether, locking in supply from Africa because of consistent quality and lower costs. Here's the twist hidden inside the numbers. This growth wasn't accidental. It was the product of intentional state policies, fertilizer subsidies in Nigeria, cooperative farming in Ghana, irrigation projects in Ethiopia. The United States once told Africa to embrace free markets, and Africa listened. Now, ironically, America is the one crying foul. But numbers alone don't tell the full story. Think about human behavior. Most American families, when shopping for groceries, rarely know or care where the garlic comes from. According to consumer studies, over 70% of buyers pick based on freshness and price. If a label shows product of Africa, but the bulb is cleaner and cheaper, the decision becomes automatic. This is the shift U.S. farmers couldn't stop because the consumer instinct to save a dollar is stronger than loyalty to a domestic brand. One short story illustrates it best. A restaurant owner in New Jersey explained in an interview that his wholesale supplier switched to African garlic without even notifying him. He only noticed weeks later when the boxes arrived labeled from Senegal. His customers never complained. In fact, he said the flavor was stronger and the bulbs lasted longer in storage. For him, the switch wasn't political, it was practical. That's the human side of globalization. People adapt when the alternative works better. So, here's the uncomfortable question. If ordinary Americans accept African garlic without resistance, what happens when African wheat or corn shows up next? Will habits shift again? Social psychology suggests they will, because people, when offered a choice between scarcity and plenty, almost always choose plenty, even if it rewrites national pride in the process. And that's why the collapse of America's garlic giant feels like more than an economic loss. It feels like the first domino in a chain reaction. As one industry analyst put it, garlic is just the opening shot. Which leads us directly into the next layer of this story, how African innovation, technology, and unexpected partnerships created an agricultural model powerful enough to shake Washington's confidence. Washington is panicking over garlic, but the deeper shock is that this miracle crop exposed the fragility of an entire American system. For years, U.S. agribusiness sold itself as unbeatable. Mechanized farms, endless subsidies, global dominance, and yet, a single bulb grown in African soil proved otherwise. That paradox is rattling policymakers who once believed agriculture was America's unshakable advantage. Congressional hearings now sound less like strategy sessions and more like emergency therapy. Senators argue over tariffs, subsidies, even sanctions, yet nothing changes the fact that African garlic has already locked in long-term contracts. Here's the hidden twist. The U.S. can't call foul without contradicting decades of its own free market preaching. After all, America told the world to compete fairly. Africa listened, and when Africa finally won, Washington cried foul. But politics only explain half the story. The human side reveals something more telling. Think about rural America. Generations who measured success by the stability of farm life, by the idea that garlic and wheat fields were eternal. Today, those same families are watching tractors sit idle, while news headlines celebrate Africa's record harvest. That before and after contrast is jarring. Once proud producers are now pleading for bailouts. If people lose faith in the idea that American land can always feed American tables, what does that do to national identity? A small-town farmer in Fresno described it this way in a local interview. "I thought I'd hand this land to my son, just like my father handed it to me. Now I'm not sure there'll be anything left to hand over." That confession is more than economics. It's generational fear, the kind that reshapes how communities see their own future. And it sparks a subtle question for viewers. If your family depended on a tradition for survival, and suddenly a continent across the ocean outperformed you at it, would you fight back, or would you adapt? Studies on consumer loyalty show that when habits are disrupted, most people don't cling to the past, they adjust. If garlic can shift global habits this quickly, the same could happen with soybeans, rice, or corn. That possibility keeps American farmers awake at night, because the next wave could wipe out more than garlic. It could rewrite the very hierarchy of food power. This is why the garlic boom feels less like a single chapter and more like a warning shot. Africa didn't just win a price war, it proved it can play the global game better, faster, and smarter. And as these truths settle in, let me pause for a moment. If you find these hidden shifts as shocking as we do, share this video with someone who thinks food is just food. Because what's unfolding is bigger than agriculture. It's a story of sovereignty, economics, and pride colliding on the world stage. And that collision takes us directly into the next layer of this journey: how Africa's embrace of technology and partnerships turned quiet farmlands into laboratories of power. The strangest part of this garlic revolution is that it didn't come from massive corporations or billion-dollar Wall Street funds. It started with small villages and modest fields. That reversal shocks many observers because the global food economy is usually driven by scale, not by scattered farmers working in semi-arid soil. Yet here is the twist. Africa achieved scale not by copying America's corporate model, but by building networks of cooperatives, state-backed irrigation, and grassroots training. Government reports show that countries like Ethiopia invested heavily in irrigation canals, while Ghana rolled out fertilizer programs targeting smallholder farmers instead of giant estates. And after that, China and India entered. Not with loans that trapped nations in debt, but with technical training and equipment. This mix created an outcome that feels almost paradoxical: local independence born from international partnerships. But the true human story lives in the daily routine of the farmers themselves. A decade ago, many families in Burkina Faso saw garlic as an imported luxury, something they bought in small amounts at crowded markets. Today, those same families are exporters, sending tons of garlic abroad while keeping enough for their communities. Imagine the psychological shift, going from buyer to seller, from dependency to pride. Social researchers often note that when people see their work valued beyond their borders, their sense of dignity multiplies, and dignity changes behavior. Take the case of one cooperative in Tanzania. Farmers there used to abandon garlic crops mid-season because of pests and low returns. Now, with resistant seeds and training, their harvests quadrupled. A farmer explained to a journalist, "We no longer fear the middleman, we negotiate directly with buyers." That statement carries weight. It shows how knowledge and organization can rewrite the rules for people who once felt powerless. For Americans watching this, there's a subtle lesson. Most US farmers assumed technology would always be their unbeatable edge. Yet here, African farmers are adopting drones for crop monitoring, AI-driven irrigation, and solar-powered cold storage. And the irony? They are using these tools with far lower costs than their US counterparts because they skipped decades of outdated methods and jumped straight into modern solutions. If human beings are offered a way to skip steps, most will take it. Think of how many Americans bypassed landlines and moved straight to cell phones, or how streaming killed DVD rentals almost overnight. Africa's garlic industry did the same with farming, leapfrogging. And now the results are undeniable: fresher crops, cheaper exports, and a continent reshaping its role in the food chain. The visual is striking. On one side of the Atlantic, abandoned silos and bankruptcy hearings. On the other, bustling African ports with containers filled to capacity. That contrast sets the stage for what comes next, because once you prove that garlic can change the map, the next logical step is asking what happens when the same model is applied to other crops. The collapse of America's garlic empire isn't just about one crop. It's about the domino effect now threatening entire supply chains. Fertilizer companies in the Midwest are reporting losses because demand from garlic farms has dried up. Trucking firms are idling their fleets. Even rural banks are tightening credit, fearing defaults from desperate farmers. The twist here is subtle but devastating. When a single crop falls, it doesn't stay isolated. It ripples through communities, businesses, and entire lifestyles. And that ripple looks very different depending on which side of the Atlantic you stand. In California, small towns are bracing for layoffs, schools for shrinking budgets, and grocery stores for higher prices. Across Africa, by contrast, new jobs are opening, new factories are rising, and entire families are seeing incomes triple. The human contrast couldn't be sharper. One region sliding backward, another leaping forward. But let's pause on something most headlines miss. For many Americans, garlic was just background, an ingredient in pasta sauce or stir-fry, rarely the center of attention. That's why the shock feels bigger now. When something you barely notice suddenly vanishes or becomes too expensive, it creates a sense of instability. Social studies often show that people adapt faster to big, visible changes than to subtle disruptions in daily habits. And losing a staple like garlic unsettles households in ways most experts didn't predict. Here's a real story that brings it closer to home. In Ohio, a family-owned pizza shop had to raise prices after their garlic supplier went bankrupt. The owner told a local reporter that customers grumbled, not because of the pizza itself, but because garlic knots, something so small, no longer tasted the same. "It's funny," he said. "People don't realize how much identity is tied up in food until the flavor changes." That short story reveals the emotional layer. Food is never just economics. It's memory and habit colliding with market forces. So what happens when those habits are forced to change? Human beings often resist at first, but over time, they adapt. Most Americans once thought imported wine was exotic. Now it's standard. The same could happen with African garlic. At first, it feels foreign. Eventually, it feels normal. And when normal changes, power shifts. This is why policymakers in Washington aren't just worried about garlic. They're worried about what comes next. If a single bulb can topple the mightiest farm sector, what will Africa do with soybeans, corn, or rice? The image is clear. Fields in Africa humming with new machinery, while fields in America go silent. And that image leads us naturally into the next part of the story, where the conversation shifts from local pain to global consequences, as Africa's rise collides with the politics of Washington and the rules of international trade. The richest country in the world now finds itself begging for protection from garlic. That irony is what fills the halls of Congress, where lawmakers who once praised free markets are now demanding tariffs and subsidies. Hearings in Washington are turning emotional. Farm state senators accusing Africa of unfair practices, lobbyists pleading for bailouts, and analysts warning that the crisis is just beginning. Yet here's the uncomfortable twist. Africa isn't breaking any rules. It's simply playing by the very playbook America once forced the world to follow. Political insiders admit that this is more than an agricultural fight. It's a credibility crisis. For decades, the U.S. lectured nations about competition and efficiency. Now, faced with Africa outcompeting them on garlic, those same voices are calling for protectionism. That reversal makes America look less like a confident superpower and more like a shaken player caught off guard. But step outside the marble buildings of Washington, and the human layer looks very different. Families in rural America are asking how the government can save farms that were once seen as untouchable. Before the garlic crash, many believed their way of life was permanent. Afterward, the mood shifted. School budgets shrinking, towns debating whether younger generations should even stay. According to surveys on rural migration, most young Americans leave farm towns not because they want to, but because they see no future in them. Garlic's fall may accelerate that exodus. Contrast that with Africa. In Ethiopia and Nigeria, young people are returning to farms, drawn by the profitability of garlic exports. One young farmer told a journalist, "I thought I'd move to the city, but farming is now a business, not a struggle." That's the before and after moment that shows how one crop can reverse migration trends. While American youth walk away from agriculture, African youth are walking back in. A small anecdote captures the tension. At a public hearing, an American farmer held up a bulb of garlic and asked, "Lawmakers, how did we let this tiny thing bring us to our knees?" The question wasn't just about garlic, it was about pride. It revealed how fragile national confidence becomes when everyday products turn into symbols of lost dominance. And here's where it touches viewers. If something as ordinary as garlic can shake a superpower, what else in your daily routine could flip without warning? Social psychology reminds us that people adapt faster than governments. Most American consumers are already buying African garlic without hesitation. If habits can change this smoothly, Maybe the real struggle isn't on supermarket shelves. It's in the political halls where denial still lingers. That's why Washington's panic feels disconnected from the ground reality. And while leaders scramble, Africa is proving that sovereignty can be built not just with speeches, but with seeds, soil, and trade. This is the quiet power shift nobody can ignore. If this perspective feels underreported in mainstream news, share this story, because more people need to see how the balance of power can change over something as simple as food. And as we turn the page, the next step becomes clear. This garlic boom isn't just about exports, it's about rewriting Africa's role in the global order, and that's where the story deepens. A crop once dismissed as kitchen spice is now forcing the world to redraw maps of power. That irony is shaking economists who long believed Africa could only supply raw materials, never shape global markets. Garlic has become proof that even the smallest product, when multiplied across borders, can rewrite the balance between continents. Trade analysts point out that the symbolism is as important as the sales. For generations, America called itself the breadbasket of the world. Yet Africa is now the one feeding Europe, Asia, and the Middle East with garlic that is cheaper, fresher, and more reliable. And here's the twist hidden inside the narrative. The United States used to warn Africa about dependency, but now Washington finds itself dependent on imports it no longer controls. This reversal has a human face too. In California's Central Valley, families who once wore their farming heritage like a badge of honor are now facing empty barns and shrinking incomes. Before, garlic fields meant stability. After the African surge, they mean uncertainty. Compare that to African households where the story flipped in the opposite direction. A Ghanaian family that once saved pennies to buy imported cloves is now exporting in bulk, sending children to school with the profits. That before and after change is not abstract. It's dignity measured in real lives. Many shifts like these raise a larger question. How do ordinary people react when global hierarchies suddenly invert? Most Americans, according to surveys, rarely notice the origin of their food until it disappears. Most Africans, on the other hand, have spent decades noticing exactly where their food came from because import reliance shaped their daily lives. If people can sense scarcity, they adapt faster when abundance finally arrives. And abundance is what Africa's garlic boom has delivered. Consider the testimony of a Nigerian cooperative leader. He recalled that 10 years ago, villagers saw garlic farming as seasonal pocket money. Today, it funds health clinics, new roads, and even scholarships. He said, "We plant garlic, but we are really planting freedom." That statement captures what numbers cannot: the emotional shift from survival to sovereignty. Meanwhile, U.S. policymakers worry that garlic is only the beginning. If Africa's model spreads to soybeans, wheat, or corn, the geopolitical impact could be seismic. Economists are already warning that American dominance in global food security may be remembered as a chapter, not a permanent fact. And here lies the twist within the twist. A continent once sidelined in trade negotiations is now writing the terms, while the old powers scramble to adjust. The image is almost cinematic. Ships leaving African ports under bright sun, while American silos sit in silence. That contrast sets the emotional stage for the conclusion, where the garlic boom is no longer just a trade story, but a declaration that Africa's rise is here, not someday in the future. A superpower has just been humbled by garlic. That sentence alone sounds absurd, but it is the reality staring Washington in the face. The United States, once untouchable in agriculture, just watched its biggest garlic producer collapse. Not because of drought, not because of climate, but because Africa outcompeted it on price, freshness, and strategy. The twist is deeper than economics. This was not an accident. It was a declaration. Africa has proven that it can feed itself and, more importantly, feed the world on its own terms. What began as small pilot projects in villages turned into a coordinated boom that now generates billions, shifts trade flows, and rewrites power dynamics. Compare before and after. 10 years ago, Africans stood in line for imports. Today, buyers from Europe and Asia stand in line for Africa's exports. And here's the human angle. Families once living on subsistence now see their children studying abroad with money earned from garlic fields. A short story from Mali captures it perfectly. A farmer who once sold garlic for pennies to a middleman now signs contracts directly with buyers in Dubai. He told a reporter, "I used to dream about feeding my family. Now I dream about feeding nations." That kind of psychological transformation shows why this moment is bigger than farming. It is about dignity, sovereignty, and control. Meanwhile, in America, the contrast is painful. Rural communities tied to garlic farming are experiencing layoffs, bankruptcies, and shrinking futures. And the question lingers. If this can happen to garlic, what stops it from happening to corn, soybeans, or wheat? Most Americans don't think about the origin of their food until it disappears. But once it does, habits change fast. History shows that people adapt quicker than governments, and consumers have already moved on. That shift is permanent. So where does this leave us? Africa has sent a message. Dependency is not destiny, and global power is not permanent. Garlic, of all things, has exposed the fragility of a giant and the resilience of a continent. And maybe it forces us all to reflect. If a bulb this small can topple an empire, what other everyday assumptions are we holding on to that could collapse tomorrow? This is where we close, but it is not where the story ends. Africa's agricultural revolution has only begun, and the next chapter could involve crops far larger than garlic. You won't want to miss it. If you found this story eye-opening, take a moment to subscribe to Africa Daily Good News. Hit like to push this conversation further, and share it with someone who still thinks Africa can't compete. And before you go, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, or share your own experience with how food choices shape your daily life. We read every comment, and your perspective adds to the debate. Stay tuned, because the next video will take you even deeper into Africa's rise. And trust me, you'll want to see how this story unfolds.